Hello everyone, welcome to our last fourth webinar of Unit 4. I'm Maria Jose, and today with Eduardo Ortiz, also a professor of this course, we will be conducting this webinar. So what we're going to do first, we are going to overview just as a way to remember what we have been doing, the 3 steps of our POBRIS 2. Then we're going to go into the details of the Unit 4, the unit that you are currently looking at our course, which is about the third and final step of our POBRIS 2, the analysis of the transition matrix and determinants. And finally, we will leave a space because we want to hear from you your final comments and thoughts about this POBRIS experience. We are very interested in knowing how you feel this course, what are your thoughts, and what do you think that this can be useful for the future for policy recommendations in your own country. So, which are the 3 steps of the POBRIS 2? You have been through this before. Just as a reminder, on the first step, we construct the data. That was Unit 2. We have 2 options for that. We can use data available to have a panel data, or we have to construct a synthetic panel. We learn the technique to construct the synthetic panel. Unit 3, once we have this data construct, we did our quantitative analysis using this panel data. We construct our transition matrix. We get from the PROVIT model the household determinants for exiting poverty and to avoid falling into poverty. And now in Unit 4, what we are doing is to analyze the products of the step 2, the transition matrix and the determinants, and we want to link this information, this quantitative information, with the country context in order to make policy recommendations for poverty eradication. So it was the final product of step 1, which is a panel data that it is at the household level that allow us to follow households into 2 periods of time. Here in this example, we have the periods 2006 and 2001. And we can follow each household over time, and we have construct our dependent and independent variables to run the regressions. The summary of the second step, the final products were the transition matrix and the marginal contributions of the significant variables of the PROVIT regressions. Here you can see our transition matrix for the same period, 2001 and 2006. And you can see 2 tables, and these 2 tables summarize all the findings of the second step. We have the marginal contributions for both transitions, the upward and the downward. So with this information, we will construct in the third step our baskets of policy recommendations. So why we're doing this, just as a reminder, we think that to achieve the SDG number 1, it is very important to know the factors associated with upward and downward mobility. And we want to know which is the policy mix required to eradicate poverty. And for that, we think that it's very important to work in both upward and downward factors of mobility that we need to break. I'm sorry?
Hi, Maria Jose.
Hi.
Okay, we have Okay, the slides is not
Oh, I
presentation.
let me see now. Sorry about that. I didn't look at the chat. Let's see. Okay, now.
Okay, can you change? Okay, we are seeing the number 3.
Now it's changing, right?
Slide 4.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. I will go just quickly through what we have seen. So this was what was I explaining, that this is our 3 steps, and now we're in Unit 4 and Step 3, and this is the final product of Step 1, which is a panel data that allow us to follow households over time. These are the products that I was talking about, that the final products of our second step. Now you can see the transition matrix, and these 2 tables are the results of the marginal contributions of the probit regressions, and with this the information, the quantitative information of these 2 tables, we are going to construct our policy recommendations. And now here it was the slide that I was talking about, that we are doing all this because we want to understand how we can eradicate poverty, but based on the reality of each household of each country. That is why we use panel data, we use information of households, and we think that it's not the same to avoid falling into poverty than to go out of poverty. So we want to find in Step 2, with the marginal contributions, those factors associated with each transition, and based on that, in the final step, Unit 4, we want to create policy recommendations that allow us to achieve the SDG number 1, including all those dimensions that are part of people progress. That is why you will see that in this unit we will go a little out of the data, and we will look to other sources in order to understand each country context. So, Step 3, Unit 4. What we're going to do here we are going to analyze the transition matrix and the determinants for both transitions. So, what do we want to do? We want to go from marginal contributions from our results of the model to policy recommendations. And we want to build 2 different baskets. We call basket, but it can be just a group of policy recommendations. One for eradicate poverty and other one to avoid falling into poverty. So the first one, the one for poverty eradication, will be constructed based on the marginal contribution of the transition from poverty to vulnerability. And our resilience basket, the core recommendations to avoid households falling into poverty, will be based on the second table that I show you, which are the marginal contributions of the transition from vulnerability to poverty. How we can present this final result? We suggest that you can write a final report with policy recommendations, or you can do diagrams. That is, it depends of how you want to present the information. But the important things is to have 2 clear groups of policy recommendations for each country. So, the first thing to do is to analyze the transition matrix. We construct in Step 2 this matrix, and now we think that we should use this information to construct profiles of each group. For example, here you know that 24% of poor population did not went out of poverty and stay into poverty, and we want to know which kind of households are they. The number of households that are in rural area, the average of children per household, head of household gender, for example. You know that in your database you have a lot of rich information about household, and it's very simple to construct some profiles to understand the composition and the characteristic of each household of the transition matrix. Also in the diagonal, you have all those households that didn't experience mobility over time. So that is they are important groups to analyze and to understand why, if there are special characteristics that didn't allow these households to experience mobility over time. And you can compare this group, and you can get important information to help your policy recommendations on the next steps. So we think that it's important to keep in mind that once the period of the Millennium Development Goal finished, each country has its own pending development agenda, and it's important to keep in mind that there is not a single recipe for poverty eradication, and there is not a single group of policy recommendations that will work for all countries. Each country have its own talents, have its own policy agenda, have its own agenda going on, and that is why it's very important to, in this step, to understand each country context in order to adapt what we found in the PROVID model to the current situation of the country. So in the case of the Latin American countries, we find out that the determinants for the upward mobility are very different to the determinants of the downward mobility. Probably, or maybe it's not the case for all countries, but we think that that is something important to keep in mind in this analysis, and to check and to analyze if, once you do this analysis, if there are differences between both the determinants of both transitions. So we think that there are three important factors that it's important to focus once we are constructing the policy recommendations. The first one is to look to other data sources in order to analyze dimensions that are not collected by data panels. As you know, the SDG agenda, it's a very ambitious agenda that have three important dimensions: the environmental, economic, and social dimension. And the data that we are using, as you can notice, doesn't capture in an integrated way these three dimensions. That's why it's important to make our policy recommendations to analyze environmental indicators, economic trajectories, and social indicators of each country. Also, it's important to focus on dimensions that are absent in most home surveys and most traditional statistics sources. For example, information related to gender gaps, to ethnic, race, and sexual orientation gaps, amongst others. We think that we know that these are very important elements of our SDG agenda, so it's important to look at each country's situation in this kind of social exclusions in order to make the appropriate policy recommendations. And finally, it's important to think about the different type of policies that can be recommended. We, in the Human Development Report, of Latin America and Caribbean of 2016, we create 3 groups of different type of policies. And these are the existing policies, new generation of policies, and complex policies. We will look to this in the next slides, but it's important to keep in mind that there is not one kind of policy for each attributions. It's important to think about which is the best policy in each country. So, about the 3 dimensions that probably are not represented on our panel data, as I was saying, it's important to look to other environmental and sustainable development indicators. For example, the World Bank data have an important database that have information about, for example, the depletion of natural resources, renewable energy, and that type of indicators that can be very useful to understand which is the current country situation in terms of sustainable development. Also, it's important to look at social policies that have been implemented over the last decades and key social indicators. For example, which is the primary education rate of the country, health system coverage, infant mortality, to understand its country talent and current situation. And also, it is very useful to look at trajectories of macroeconomic indicators. For example, how has been the GDP growth, poverty rates, public social spending, because these kind of indicators can be very useful to understand the mobility of households in the period that we are taking into account, to understand the government spending decisions, and that can help us to make the best kind of policy recommendations and to make the best interpretation of our marginal contributions. So also the dimensions that are not captured by home surveys are important to look at. As I was saying, for example, here are a number of dimensions that are part of poverty that we don't get from our normal household surveys. For example, the labor quality, empowerment of household, the well-being that experience household, the use of time between and especially the difference between men and women in each household, gender gaps, environmental vulnerability, citizen security, between others. So we think that it's very important to look at other sources, non-traditional sources, in order to get information about these missing dimensions. Of course, there are countries, and in our region especially, most of the countries do not have all this information, and it's very difficult to find out sources that you can trust that have this kind of data, but at least it must be done the effort of look at all the possible sources available in order to make public policy recommendations that address the multiple dimensions that are part of individual progress. So, and finally, what I was saying before, the type of policies. It's very important to understand that there is not a unique kind of policy to make recommendations. Here, in this diagram, we can see 3 groups that we created of type of policies. We have the what we call the existing. What we call the existing policies, that are policies that currently are going on most of all countries of the region. For example, government policies for pension systems, for formal jobs, for basic needs, between others. Then we have what we call a new generation of policies that are some policies that are going on currently on our region, but still are in development. As for example, the development of system of care for elderly and children, policies to reduce the time used between men and women, policies to increase the productivity of workers, between others. And finally, we have what we call complex policies that they need of deeper drivers and complex change and requires more time and requires an institutional change in each country. And here we have policies like political participation, recognition and reorganization of care economy, universal access to justice, changing use of natural resources, between others. So what we have to think about when we are in this step and when we are making policy recommendation is to think about country context and to think which is the kind of policy that are needed in this moment, which are the realistic type of policy that have a space in the country and that are in line with the current social agenda and to the current challenge that is. Example, we can get from our marginal contributions that the presence of a child under 12-year-old increase the probability of falling into poverty. So that kind of a marginal contribution can have very different interpretations and can deliver us very different type of policy recommendations. So we have to think about the country that we are looking at and to see which are the kind of policy that currently have for childcare. We need to improve the quality of the current conditional cash transfer, or it can be the case that they don't have a conditional cash transfer program. So we should create recommend to create a conditional cash transfer program so poor household can go to the labor market and they can pay for system of care, or we should provide free system of care for children under 12 years. So there, as you can see, there are a lot of different approaches to create a policy recommendation from a why it's very important to analyze all the factors that I have just mentioned. So now, Eduardo, we will continue with examples from our Latin American experience doing this exercise. And thank you.
Hello, everyone. Hello, I hope you are well. Yeah, as Maria Jose just mentioned it very clearly, is yeah, I mean, she summarized the rationale of this exercise, and she illustrated, I think that very in a clear way how the different steps have been followed to reach a potential interpretation that we will link to a potential policy strategy. Yeah, and yes, the rationale of this is, and the rationale of the new development agenda is that there are no silver bullet policies. There are no single recipes to attack a unique problem. For instance, during the 90s and during the last decade, all the social policy in most countries has been focused on reducing poverty through conditional cash transfers, which, of course, in addition to reduce short-term poverty, the main component is to invest in human capital as an attempt to break the intergenerational cycle of poverty. But that strategy has been successful in many countries, has been proven effective in reducing poverty and in investing in and in the formation of human capital. But at the same time, several evaluations have demonstrated that something is missing there, that the link between the human capital formation and the labor market has been failing. Is not a clear link there. And the policies, a second generation of policies designed and focused to attend new needs of these children that are graduating from the CCTs. I mean, there are a lack of strategies there in terms of several dimensions, in terms of labor market, in terms of social protection, in terms of quality of higher education, in terms of asset formation and asset protection, etc., etc., etc. So over the last years, a huge and important debate has been on the table regarding the need for additional strategies and strategies that are adapted to the context of each country. So the CCTs has been successful. We are not advocating for no more CCTs. I think, and we think, and I think that most of us agree that conditional cash transfers are a program that should be there, should be reinforced, should be they should be improved, but they should be also complemented with additional policies, which vary from context to context. The conditional cash transfers were developed in different countries following the same strategy, following almost the same structure. So in that sense, it's a silver bullet policy. And the main message of the Latin American report and the main conclusion of this intense debate about new policies is what will be a next generation of policy, what will be an efficient strategy to complement CCTs, what happened to those households and individuals that exceeded poverty, and now they are in a current situation of vulnerability. Those households, usually, when they cross the poverty line, practically they are out of the scope of social policy, because social policy, as I said, has been focused only on poverty reduction. So, following or based on that need, on that debate about the additional strategies, we promoted the main messages of this report, which is the basis of this series of webinars and exercises that you have been developing. So we have a challenge, that is how to design or how to propose new policies, but we also have a restriction, which is the availability of information. So in some in very few countries we had the opportunity to have access to longitudinal data to track the same individuals over time and to try to identify the main correlates of the transitions and to isolate the main contributions to the probabilities of transition. But in most of the countries we couldn't access that information because it simply doesn't exist. So we adopted an approach based on synthetic panels, which is an econometric and a statistical exercise which is subject to several advantages, but also to several drawbacks as any other econometrical technique. So it's important to keep in mind that our main message from the marginal contributions approach is that they are not indicating a specific and a true and a unique path to follow. They are signaling what are the profiles of the households and the individuals that achieved a specific transition to a better or to a worse well-being state. And based on that correlation, given that the available information, that information is the best we can have to try to adjust and to analyze our context, the specific context of the country, and to try to propose a potential policy associated to that information from the marginal contribution. So in that sense, as Maria Jose just said, that a marginal contributions of having an additional child or an additional elderly in the household reduces the probability of falling back into poverty. The main message should not be, okay, let's have an additional elderly in the household. Let's invite our grandmother to live with us because that will be that will allow us to protect from falling back into poverty. So the literal recommendation is not true, and that's the same with that caricaturized example to several other examples. I mean, I think that the main message is the underlying implication of that result, which is that if an additional elderly within the household reduces my probability to falling into poverty, it should be due to a broad trend taking place, which is, for instance, that the current system of pensions targeted to the elderly has been working well, has been protecting the elderly, has been increasing the opportunities, the economic opportunities for these people to be better protected, to be more economic secure, etc., etc. So again, it's important to keep in mind that the rationale of this is the need for several additional and complementary strategies, multidimensional strategies, beyond the single anti-poverty unique strategy, and with the restriction of information that we have in many countries, in several countries across Latin America. So using the synthetic panels, we have to be very careful in estimating our models, our transition matrices, and in isolating our marginal contributions, and to understand the context, the local context in which that marginal contribution is estimated, to link it to a broad a broad message, which could derive in a potential policy recommendation. So, in terms of data interpretation, for instance, some examples taken from the Latin America report. This and the next slides will show you some data interpretations. For instance, the current slide shows the probability of moving out of poverty. And as I said, Brazil, Chile, and Argentina having an additional elderly within the households increases the probabilities in Chile, for instance, in 7 percentage points, in Brazil 20 percentage points, vis-a-vis a base household. And on the contrary, on the Dominican Republic and Ecuador and Colombia, the marginal contribution of this additional elderly individual within the household to reduce the probability of moving out of poverty. This is not a literal result. This is related with, as I said, with the pension systems that are working well or less efficiently depending on the country. So Argentina, Chile, and Brazil have been characterized are characterized by having a comprehensive social protection system, especially in the case of Argentina and Chile. Well, Brazil is a huge system as well, but that's the contrary to countries like Ecuador or Colombia, where the social protection system is still under construction. It's not of a universal nature, and in Argentina and Chile it is. I mean, especially since the beginning of the last decade, the social protection in those countries has improved significantly, and that is likely the reason why we are obtaining these marginal contributions. So, per se, having an additional elderly, or per se, as another example, having a car or not having insurance, I mean, we should be able to frame and to embed that result into the specific context of the country that we are analyzing. So, having an additional elderly in Chile and Argentina is mostly due to the comprehensive social protection system. Better protected elderly people, of course, contribute with additional income into the households, and in turn, that protects the household from falling into poverty. So, if in Argentina and Chile and Brazil we observe those results, we should be able to interpret that, to compare with the situation in the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Colombia, and other countries, and try to understand those results with the result that we are obtaining in any given specific country, and try to figure out how a policy recommendation could be framed. Another example, the rural and urban divide. In many countries, it's important. We observe and we know, and it is evident, both by simple observation or by looking at the data, that there are huge gaps between the urban and rural areas in most of the Latin American countries. But for instance, in Chile, where that divide is less pronounced, in fact in Chile, rural characteristics, depending on where in the country, but in Chile, rural employment policies could have a positive effect on household mobility, and that's the contrary to, for instance, in Central America or in Bolivia or in Peru. Okay, in Chile, for instance, a given individual working in a rural area increases the probability of moving out of poverty by 7.6 percentage points. But in Guatemala, living in a rural area implies above 30 percentage points less in the probability to move out of poverty. So again, a result like this, we have to be able to understand it and to frame it into the context narrative. So here, the interpretation is not, or a potential policy recommendation is not that, okay, let's move all the population to the urban areas. No, that's the caricaturized option. I mean, what we should be able to analyze and to interpret and to analyze carefully is, okay, what can be done in the rural areas? What projects we can invest there? With what type of infrastructure we can develop there? We can, I don't know, we can give access to markets. We can construct roads for farmers to be able to reach some more developed markets, etc., etc. So those strategies probably will affect positively these negative probabilities of moving out of poverty, for instance. So an individual is still living in a rural area, but with better opportunities, with better productive options, will be benefited, and of course it will be regarded as a positive policy. As another example, the possession of assets, or the availability of pensions, which I mentioned before. But again, this graph, this chart is showing the change in the probability of escaping income poverty linked to various factors. So, for instance, in Peru and in Jamaica, the availability of durable assets, it's related to a higher probability of escaping poverty. So again, this is not implying that, okay, in my case as a policymaker, then I will give more televisions or more credits to buy a car to the households in poverty, because that asset will allow them to protect. No, I mean, the underlying message here is the need for integrated and comprehensive policies protecting the assets and influencing the creation of productive assets across the households, especially for those especially for those in poverty, but more importantly for those above the poverty line, but which are facing a potential risk of falling back into poverty. Without a universal social insurance, without a comprehensive social protection system, okay, access to credits, access to debt, access to mechanism to create assets, it's an important policy itself. Examples are there are several examples of this type of interpretation, but I mean I would like to highlight that we have to be careful and we have to keep in mind that we have limited information, and with that limited information, it's our responsibility to do the best interpretation given the context of our country. So, from marginal contributions to policy, as an overview, yeah, we can at least for this series of webinar, the activities consisted in reaching two different baskets, one to eradicate poverty and one called the resilience basket to avoid falling into poverty. Yeah, and the idea was to show you how to identify those significant correlates, their contributions, and how to embed this information into two broad areas of potential policies. So mainly for movements out of poverty are demographic and educational factors. And for the protection basket is mainly social protection through insurance, through pensions, through better job markets or well-functioning markets, through access to financial and physical assets. And that's it. I mean, these are examples. There is no need to summarize to read this summary. I think that we have covered, and probably it's better for you to raise some questions. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eduardo, for your presentation and for giving us some examples of policies on our region. It's very useful to understand from what we have been done in the region how to go to policy recommendation, because as you were saying, there is no a single recipe, and it's very important to understand its country context to make the best recommendation. So I think that there are some questions or comments. Here we have from Ruben that asks, but how will that work in practice? Is there that policies to be proposed? Also Ruben says, in the case of Latin America and Caribbean, have we taken enough consideration of the macroeconomic and political developments into account when analyzing the conditional cash transfers and their success, especially in relation to the ability of groups, individuals moving out of poverty? I don't know, Eduardo, if you have any comment about.
Thank you, Maria Jose. I mean, how will that work in practice is difficult to say, and I think that's precisely the next step for us, or for a next or for a follow-up report. In fact, we are working on that. Based on this evidence, now we are producing a follow-up short report, more focused on policies and on how to embed this evidence at the individual level into a broader perspective, linked to different aspects that are especially difficult, which are the macroeconomic environment, the political economy environment. So, yeah, I mean I have no an answer, because it's not a simple answer, but we are working on that, and that is the next challenge. It's important to know that to notice that we have presented during the last seminars and in the last Caribbean and Latin American report is evidence based on individual level data, and the link that we are doing based on that evidence is, of course, is imperfect, is the underlying trends of those results. How to implement that? Okay, we can for instance, we can evaluate how viable is a specific recommendation by implementing fiscal simulations, for instance. We have developed those in the case of Mexico, in the case of Costa Rica and Honduras and other countries, precisely to see how viable it is to change the amount of social transfers, the amount of taxes, etc., etc. So the next challenge, of course, is that, and is to implement those exercises. And in fact, one of the goals of this toolkit is beyond the econometric exercise and the marginal contributions, is to take into account the macroeconomic accounts, the political account. Well, the political variables are more difficult, but at least the fiscal and the macroeconomic environment should be put. We are developing a strategy to take into account that using specifically microsimulation techniques. That is a strategy that we are working on, and in fact, one of the goals of this series of webinars is to prepare the participants to get involved, to specialize in these techniques, and to start working or representing the toolkit in each country to develop these strategies in a more complex context, linked to macroeconomic variables, etc., etc., etc.
Thank you, Eduardo, for your answer. There are not more questions, but it would be great if any of you want to make any comment to the course. This is our last webinar, so it will be great to hear from you, not necessarily about this, the content of this webinar, just to know how you feel with this pub risk experience. How do you think that this can be useful for your future work, or any comments or thought you have about the course? Alistair just wrote that it was a great course, that learned a lot. Thank you for that. Also, it will be great to hear from you how you feel with the homework. We know that the homework were very technical, and we know that some of you experienced some difficulty because of the language of our database. I answer all the questions about the variables and any doubts that you have about the translation and how to finish the homework. But also, I hope that it wasn't a big difficulty for you, that the database was in Spanish. But it's an important feedback that for next version of the course we will definitely create a database for homework in English. And though I don't know if there is any comment. Okay, so here we have from Ruben. Ruben says that overall very interesting course, very technical. on the statistical data component. Yes, we know, Ruben, this course is a very technical course, and that is why we did this 2 tracks alternative. Still, we know that for the basic tracks, still it was a little technical, but we think that the type of content that we see in this tool are very technical. So we try to simplify them the more that we can do, but still it can be a little difficult for some people to get and to understand in a virtual course. Or also, Wanik said that this course is of great help to us, and the tools will enable us to improve the quality of collected data in the country of the region. Thank you for that, Wanik. Marianne said that it was an interesting course, learned quite a bit about vulnerability and household transitioning to and from poverty. Thank you for that. A lot of thank you. And Elisha said, for me, the course was useful in understanding a bit more about factors that move people out of poverty and prevent people from sliding into poverty. It's useful to understand to create more evidence-based policies. It is indeed extremely technical for those of us in the basic track, but the understanding of the end result will be useful in devising policy. Thanks a lot. Thanks to you, Elisha. And we are very pleased to hear about that, because we know that probably the students from the basic track were not able to capture all the details. For example, especially in Unit 2, where we went through the panel, synthetic panel construction and a lot of technical details. But still, we think that even if it's not possible to understand everything, to go through this information is helpful for the future, and for the case, for example, that you are part of a group that is discussing this type of policy. You know, not in detail, but you know which are the steps to construct this kind of tool, which are the challenges, and that can be very, very useful for helping in the construction of this tool. So I think that also Clifford said, best regards, very great, thank you. So I think that there's no more comments. Thank you all for participating of this last webinar, and thank you all for being part of this published tool. Still there is time if you want to submit your homework from Unit 3, especially for those that haven't completed the homework of the econometric track. Still there is time, so we encourage you to finish your homework. If you have any question, please write me, write Eduardo. We're happy to assist you. And thank you very much for being part of this first version of this course. I don't know, Eduardo, if you want to add something, since that I'm not sure if Eduardo is there, but yes, Wanik, I think that the assessment of Unit 3 is still open, so it will be great if any of you that haven't completed yet this assignment can finish it. It will be we have time to correct that, so I encourage you to finish the assignment. So thank you all, and thank you, Andrea, Oscar, and all the team of making possible this webinar. Thank you very much.